Okay, thanks everybody for coming. My name's Spencer Leonard. I'm a founding member of Platypus. This is technically what I talked about with Justin when we were planning this, a book launch, though. The book is still, we're still debating, I'm still debating with my publisher exactly how we're going to bring it out. I told them the the book was long, and now they're contemplating possibly even 2 volumes. But in one form or another, it will come out soon, and I want to talk about that today. The book is called Marx and Engels on Imperialism, and it's a selection of Marx's and Engels's journalism from the period of 1851 to 1862, which was the darkest time politically in Marx and Engels's lives after the coup d'etat in France. The really political night fell over Europe, especially over the socialist movement. There was no ability for Marx and Engels to organize or really to publish on the continent. Of course, Marx and Engels were capable of writing in German or in French. That neither was possible in that period, though Marx begins to publish in German in liberal papers in the second half of the 1850s. What he does do is he writes a massive amount for the American press. He writes for the New York Tribune. This is really Marx's only sustained professional gig in his life. This is a newspaper that was founded by Horace Greeley. He was recruited, Marx was recruited by a socialist who had been a part of a Fourierist colony in New York with Nathaniel Hawthorne and others. And it was the largest circulation newspaper in the world at that time because it was selections of the best articles would be sent around America in a weekly edition to the far-flung provinces. So people like Abraham Lincoln in Illinois would certainly have read Marx, though often they wouldn't know. They wouldn't have known who Karl Marx was. First of all, Karl Marx was not particularly famous in the 1850s, and in addition, a lot of what he wrote was so good that the editors of the New York Tribune basically stole it from Marx, and I mean they paid him for it, but they published it as if it was their own editorial. So this was a Republican newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper, and eventually the politics of the Republican Party played out in its editorial rooms with Marx's friend and agent, a man named Charles Dana, the man who I told you about, had lived in a Fourierist colony in his youth and had gone to Europe in 1848 to cover the revolution and had met Marx there. He became radicalized and became Lincoln's liaison to Grant in the period. He was really responsible for elevating Grant to the leadership of the entire Union armies. And Horace Greeley eventually became against the war, tried to make peace, and was ultimately a presidential candidate running against Grant in the election of 1872. So this newspaper was a kind of a dying breed of a liberal or left liberal outlet. You could see it as maybe an expression of the backwardness politically of the United States, the lack of a socialist movement. If you want to view the Republican Party as a kind of a backward expression, or it's a kind of liberal expression. It's registering the crisis of liberalism. The Republican Party is, but within, largely speaking, the framework of liberalism. Of course, by the time of the American Civil War, that the nature of that split will put the United States sort of firmly back in the position that it had been for most of the 19th century, which is by far and away the most revolutionary place in the world, the epicenter of the revolution of the 1860s, which was nevertheless under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln and General Grant and others, without ever splitting, really. So this is who Marx wrote for. He wrote in English. He was, Marx was pretty bright, and he was a quick study. So he learned English. He accepted the job actually before he knew English, and he would write in German and send it to Engels to be rapidly translated. They had the penny post by that time, so that something he sent to Manchester in the morning would be there in the night, and Engels could translate it and send it back in the morning, and it would be there the following evening. So about a 36-hour turnaround. But within 6 months, Marx was writing in English, and so I have edited. Selected about 85 articles from overwhelmingly the stuff that was written for the Tribune, but with a smattering of things that were written in German, some of which I've retranslated and some of which I've left alone. And so that's the book, and this is a material that's widely published. It has been published. It's widely known. But one of the things that I talk about in the prefatory materials is both an editor's preface where I talk about the history of publishing Marx posthumously as a political act, how editing Marx places you in a history of essentially the reassertion of Marx in the face of the crisis of socialism and of Marxism, and that ultimately there was a struggle over the literary legacy of Marx and Engels as part of the struggle for orthodoxy. Ultimately, Lenin insisting that a Marx-Engels Institute be created in the Soviet Union to publish Marx and Engels. He viewed that as a crucial project of the revolution, to pry the papers of Marx and Engels out of the hands of Edward Bernstein. But really, this material had no significant impact on the Marxism of the 20th century. Certainly nothing like the impact that other posthumous Marx publications like the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts or the Grundrisse, or something we're talking about today, Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, only the introduction of which was known in the 19th century, the rest being published by the Marx-Engels Institute in the 30s, the German ideology, other texts. These texts were really important, especially for those who fully received them, namely the New Left. So in the reading group, we talk about the importance of the Grundrisse for Nicolaus and Postone. But if we were talking about an earlier reception of Marx for the New Left, say from 1956 to 1966, you'd talk a lot about the importance of the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts as generating an anti-Stalinist Marx, being taken up to that project by people like Marcuse. The journalism was almost entirely, as it were, in the hands of Stalinism. It was really published by the Stalinists, and it reinforced Stalinism. It was never significantly addressed by the neo-Marxism or the return to Marx of the 50s and 60s. It comes out in books like On Colonialism or on Britain, or Marx on colonialism and modernization. These books reinforced, for the most part, the anti-imperialism of the Stalinist left, which was, of course, the dominant Marxism of the New Left. Even the New Left never really came to terms with the question of imperialism. And so the argument that I make in this book is, I make a number of arguments, but basically I'm saying if we look at the writings that Marx wrote from the time of the 18th Brumaire, in which he adumbrates the question of Bonapartism, to the period of the composition of capital, the First International, and the Paris Commune, where obviously he articulates the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, rounding off that category of Bonapartism. Everything in between contributes, and in fact capital has to be understood as contributing to the same anti-imperialist project. Imperialism understood, as I say, as Bonapartism. And that's the unifying theme of his journalism. And we shouldn't divide it up in a kind of Stalinoid way by national roads to socialism or third worldist roads to socialism, which is effectively the way the Stalinists published it, but should rather see it as flowing out of Marx's journalism in the Revolution of 1848, what he wrote for the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which was his newspaper in Cologne, which I strongly encourage you to read what Marx wrote in the Revolution in his newspaper with Engels. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung political economic review, in which the class struggles in France was published, for instance, or the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which was published in an immigrant newspaper in New York City, a German immigrant journal in New York City that had one issue, and that issue was the 18th Brumaire, published by his friend Joseph Wedemeyer, who went on to be an officer in the Union Army. So I'm just going to read a bit from the introduction. This is midway through my introduction. Marx began his political life as a journalist and was jealously defensive of the honor of his profession. His very first publications in the Rheinische Zeitung in 1842 opposed Prussian press censorship, as did the last thing he wrote in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in the Revolution in 1849. When, in the midst of the Revolution of 1848, he was put on trial for editing that revolutionary organ, Marx concluded his courtroom defense, which won him both the jury's applause and their acquittal, by proclaiming the first duty of the press to be to undermine all the foundations of the existing political state of affairs. And press freedom was always central to Marx and Engels' conception of socialist politics. 15 years later, towards the end of the U.S. Civil War and immediately after the founding of the First International, Engels stated simply, unless there is freedom of the press, the right of association, and the right of assembly, all of which are under assault by the Democrats, no workers' movement is possible. He reiterated the same point in 1871 in an address to the International Working Men's Association, saying, the political freedoms, the right of assembly and association, the freedom of the press, those are our weapons. Polemicizing mercilessly against the Lassalleans' idolization of universal suffrage democracy at the expense of civil liberty, Marx lambasted their view, the Lassalleans' view, that socialist politics might safely neglect such subordinate things as the freedom of the press and the right of association and assembly, which he did not fail to observe even the bourgeoisie stood for. Systematizing Marxism in 1892, Karl Kautsky reinforced this Marxian legacy, saying, "Every class struggle is a political struggle. On this account, wherever the working class has organized itself, it has made political demands, especially demands for a free press and the right of assembly. Whoever attempts to deny those rights is to be reckoned amongst the worst enemies of the working class." Liberalism as an ideology, of course, both constituted and arose from bourgeois social relations. It was enmeshed in the contradictions of the society to which it gave rise in the era of capitalism. The bourgeoisie, this is Engels, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are both progeny of a new era. Both are striving to eliminate the remnants of the bric-a-brac left over from earlier times. It is true that there is a most serious conflict to be settled between them, but this conflict can only be fought out when they're facing each other alone. Only by jettisoning the old lumber can the decks be cleared for battle, except that this time the battle will be fought not between two ships, but on board the one ship, between the officers and the crew. As distinct from the old estates distinguished by birth, the bourgeoisie must proclaim human rights. As distinct from the guilds, the bourgeoisie must proclaim freedom of trade and industry. As distinct from the tutelage of the bureaucracy, the bourgeoisie must proclaim freedom and self-government. To be consistent, it must therefore demand universal, direct suffrage, freedom of the press, association and assembly, and the suspension of all special laws directed against individual classes of the population. Concluding that there is nothing else that the proletariat needs to demand from the existing political order, it would be idle, Engels maintains, to demand that the bourgeoisie should cease to be a bourgeoisie. But the proletariat certainly can require that bourgeois society practices its own principles consistently. Historically, this strategy built the socialist workers' movement. The working class furthered their own development and organization precisely through and with this movement, whose immediate aims were purely bourgeois in nature more than by any other method, unquote. The political movement for socialism developed within civil society and demanded the freedom necessary to do so. The exercise of civil liberties is what Marxism means by socialist politics per se. As Lenin would later put it, the identity of the most pressing need of the proletariat with the need of the general democratic movement had to be expressed as a comprehensive political education through the medium of agitation and political exposure in the press, he means. From the Grub Street pamphlet mills and John Milton's classic defense of free speech, the Areopagitica in 1644, during the English Civil War, to Thomas Paine's American Crisis and Jean-Paul Marat's L'Ami du Peuple in the high bourgeois revolutions, journalism, as Marx well knew, was the lifeblood of revolution. Necessarily, then, it got embroiled in the crisis of politics, revolutionary and otherwise, under conditions of capital. The public sphere itself, the very existence of public reason, was not immune to the self-contradiction into which bourgeois society had fallen. As Jürgen Habermas argued more than half a century ago, the emergence of socialism and the Revolution of 1848 drove the bourgeois public sphere into crisis. Reattaining Marx's recognition of a century before that socialist politics required the workers' and capitalists' economic conflict to be translated into the only form holding any promise of success into political conflict. Habermas saw that socialism required the masses to employ the platform of the public sphere, not to destroy it, but to make it into what, according to liberal pretense, it had always claimed to be. This Marx and Engels attempted to do during the Revolution of 1848 in the pages of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, but as they soon discovered, the potential occupation of the political public sphere by socialism undermined that project. Addressing the needs of society was a threat to public safety. With the revolution's failure and helping to precipitate it, there developed, quote, and this is Habermas, an interlocking of state and society which removed the public sphere from the public sphere its former basis without supplying a new one, unquote. In the new era of mass democracy, the integration of the public and private realms entailed a corresponding disintegration of the public sphere that once was the go-between linking the state and society. This crisis of the public sphere was no mere matter of censorship or manipulation by particular interests. It wasn't just a matter of manufacturing consent, in other words, much less of the outright muzzling of the press, though, of course, there was plenty of that, not least in the Second Empire in France. In place of public reason, newspapers, pamphlets, and other publications, mass media, in place of public reason enabled, that's an unfortunate phrase, Spencer, newspapers, pamphlets, and publications, mass media emerged. A change masked by the persistence in seemingly unchanged form of newspapers, pamphlets, and publications. Habermas puts it this way: the mediating function passed from the public to such institutions as have arisen out of the private sphere, special interest associations, for instance, or out of the public sphere, for instance, political parties. These now engage in the exercise and equilibration of power in cooperating with the state apparatus, treating it as a matter internal to their own organizations. He's talking about the rise of Bonapartist politics, racket politics. At the same time, they endeavor via mass media that have themselves become autonomous to attain the agreement, or at least the acquiescence, of a mediatized public. Liberals had argued publicity guaranteed the connection between rational, critical public debate and the legislative foundation of domination, including the critical supervision of its exercise. But the society that liberals helped create was transformed by the very realization of their project, that is, as freedom itself grew self-contradictory. Capitalist democracy issued from this contradiction. Managing it made possible the peculiar ambivalence of a domination exercised through the dominion of a non-public opinion. As Marx put it in the 18th Brumaire, the bourgeoisie have never wearied of crying out to the revolution what Saint Arsenius cried to the Christians: fuge, tace, quiesce, flee, be silent, keep still. Bonaparte cries to the bourgeoisie. In such an environment, the struggle for socialism cannot dispense with journalism. As Lenin wrote, newspapers, pamphlets, and leaflets perform the indispensable work of propaganda, agitation, and organization. No mass movement in any country at all civilized can get along without a journalistic apparatus. This raises the question of the role of intellectuals. Again, Lenin, no outcries against leaders or solemn vows to keep the masses uncontaminated by the influence of leaders will relieve us of the necessity of using for this work people from a bourgeois intellectual environment. Nothing will rid us of the bourgeois democratic, private property atmosphere and environment in which this work is carried out under capitalism. The issue that Habermas, Marx, and Lenin address is not simply that the press or journalists come to uphold or tend to uphold the interests of the wealthy and powerful, nor is the mere consolidation of ownership what is at issue. For the professional journalist herself, the issue is ultimately one of what Lukács terms reification, whereby subjectivity itself, knowledge, temperament, and powers of expression are reduced to an abstract mechanism, functioning autonomously and divorced both from the personality of the owner and from the material and concrete nature of the subject in hand. For Lukács, the professional journalist's lack of convictions, the prostitution of her experiences and beliefs, must be recognized as the apogee of capitalist reification. Walter Benjamin makes the same point by looking at the consumption of the capitalist press. After 1848, it's a matter of chance whether an individual forms an image of himself. Man's inner concerns do not have their issueless private character by nature. They do so only when he is increasingly unable to assimilate the data of the world around by way of experience. Newspapers constitute one of the many evidences of such an inability. If it were the intention of the press to have the reader assimilate the information it supplies as part of his own experience, it would not achieve its purpose. But its intention is just the opposite, and it is achieved: to isolate what happens from the real in which it could affect the experience of the reader. This is no mere matter of journalists selling out or of public apathy, but of the obscuring of the totality precisely through the illumination of particulars. Fake news need not be fake, as in the age of capital, journalists grow simultaneously jaded and sentimental. Benjamin's friend and Habermas's teacher, Theodor Adorno, underscores the change in a different register. Societal consciousness tacitly renounces a distinction between truth and opinion, a renunciation that does not leave the moment of spirit unaffected. Truth becomes opinion to the consciousness that is wise to the world, as with the journalist. But opinion replaces truth with itself. In place of the both problematical and binding idea of truth in itself, there appears the more comfortable idea of truth for us, whether it be for everyone or at least for many. Periodical publication, that most emblematic practice of the Enlightenment, thus became at the same time a means of coordinating reason with the maintenance of the status quo. The proletariat reads newspapers, and like them, the new journalism was itself a product of industrialization. Indeed, the very masthead of the New York Tribune bore an image of workers serving a new steam-powered printing press. For Marx, this, again like proletarianization itself, was not simply to be affirmed as progress. In a letter to Kugelmann, he remarked, "Up to now, it was believed that the development of the Christian myths under the Roman Empire had been possible only because the printing press had not yet been invented. Just the contrary. The daily press and the telegraph, which in a trice spread their disclosures over the whole earth, fabricate more myths, which the bourgeois cattle believe and disseminate, in one day than could formerly have been turned out in a century." Unquote. Mass literacy, no less than social atomization, was a precondition of mass democracy. It is therefore unsurprising that Marx grappled less with the conservative than with the Palmerstonian press. Lord Palmerston was the sort of British parliamentary expression of Bonapartism. He's the sign or the vessel of the Bonapartization of the British state in the 1850s for Marx. The Palmerstonian press, above all the Times of London, which he termed Palmerston's Moniteur, which is the name of Louis Bonaparte's paper, the official paper of the Second Empire. To Marx, Palmerston represented less a class interest than the interest of the imperialist state itself. More specifically, the English press, like Palmerston, represented not only a British, but a world imperial state interest. No less than, arguably more than, Louis Bonaparte himself, Palmerston expressed the permanency of the crisis of executive power on a world scale. Because it rested upon capital, bourgeois society in a state of crisis, in a state of self-contradiction, the state possesses a peculiar morality of its own, a kind of superior law of raison d'etat. The Palmerstonian press normalized what could only appear as permanent executive government. Marx's, I'll skip that actually. Just a last bit, and then we'll open up for questions. Under Louis Bonaparte's regime in France, especially in the 1850s, the press was gagged. This contrasted markedly from the situation in Britain. There, broadly speaking, free speech prevailed. There was no press censorship. But increasingly, the newspapers addressed themselves not so much to reason as to public opinion, not so much to the people as to the masses, not so much to the nation as to John Bull, the personification of national chauvinist England. Marx's analysis showed how politicians and bureaucrats did not so much represent society as managed it, showed how the state was no longer comprehensible in liberal terms. The press catered to what Marx, adopting a kind of shorthand, thought of as petty bourgeois subjectivity. Adorno epitomizes the question when he writes, "While the latest phase of class society vindicates the doctrines of class struggle with its concentration and centralization, extreme power and extreme impotence directly confronting one another in total contradiction, it makes people forget the actual existence of hostile classes. The invisibility of classes is caused by the petrified mold in which they are held fast." It is in this sense that Marx and Engels scornfully remarked during the Crimean War, "The English press in general has proved a worthy representative of the petty bourgeoisie." The vulgarization of liberalism in the organs of Richard Cobden and John Bright, the liberals of the age, found a counterpart in its sworn enemy, the Palmerstonian press. Official Britain's pretense to liberalism as a national virtue are presupposed in Marx's preferred method of ideology critique. Given British press freedom, Marx suggested that, in the wake of the French coup d'etat, the destruction of the last remnants of an independent press on the continent has made it the honorable duty of the English press to record every act of illegality and oppression in that quarter. For an instant, at least, Bonaparte's coup had shocked even British conservatives, perhaps them especially. As Marx wrote of the coup d'etat, even the high priests of the religion of order themselves are driven with kicks from their Pythian tripods, hauled out of their beds in the darkness of night, put in prison vans, thrown into dungeons, or sent into exile. Their temple is razed to the ground. Their mouths are sealed, their pens are broken, their law torn to pieces, in the name of religion, of property, of the family, of order. Bourgeois fanatics for order are shot down on their balconies by mobs of drunken soldiers, their domestic sanctuaries profaned, their houses bombarded for amusement in the name of property, of the family, of religion, and of order. And of course, Marx is referring to specific incidents that took place on the most fashionable avenues of Paris, where the British aristocracy's friends lived, where they indeed would stay when they would routinely go to Paris. In this passage, Marx was highlighting the shooting that took place on the Boulevard des Italiens and de Bonne Nouvelle and in Montmartre, a fashionable district of the city. Though the French press was muzzled, the outrages in Paris were widely reported in the foreign press, and the British ruling class could not but take exception to such illegality and oppression. against their French counterparts. Bonaparte's regime overturned their rule and violated their rights. As Engels remarked in a Chartist newspaper, the Notes to the People, the working class had at the moment of the late coup d'etat very little, if anything, to lose in the chapter of political privileges. But on the other hand, the middle and capitalist classes were at that time in possession of political omnipotence. Theirs was the press, the right of meeting, the right to bear arms, the suffrage, and the parliament. It was indeed hard to be robbed of all of this in the short space of a few hours, and to be reduced at once to the state of a political nullity. So this is all to say that in that background, Marx jibed, well, maybe the English press will keep a record of all of the violations of liberalism on the continent, since they do recognize it. So Marx mischievously suggested their liberal instincts would impel British journalists to scrutinize the unfolding political crisis. If French mouths were sealed, if French pens were broken, it was surely the English journalist's duty to watch and document. And yet, strangely, this did not happen. Instead, the English press swiftly recovered from its shock and accepted imperialism not as a threat to, but guardian of, a new status quo. After all, even if universal suffrage democracy was still unattained in Britain, the mass politics that raised Louis Bonaparte to power and ratified his coup d'etat was most certainly familiar. British journalism did not report on the continent differently than it did on Britain and its empire. I go on to talk here about, in effect, the way that Marx conducts an eminent dialectical critique of journalism. The way that he not only conducts a running commentary on journalism, but that really what you're seeing in the attempt to, of course, on the one hand, he is trying to be a good bourgeois journalist, he is trying to be the heir of the great journalists of the bourgeoisie, and at the same time, he's constantly talking about, in effect, it's basically his method is that he goes to the coffee shop, he's a poor man, he goes to the English coffee shops, and for the price of a cup of coffee, you get to read the newspaper. And he sits and reads the whole English press. And what he tells the Americans is, this is the crisis of the English press. On every single question of the day for 10 years, culminating in his account of the American Civil War and how it's being betrayed in the supposedly liberal organs, the supposedly abolitionist organs, because of course Britain's liberalism is perhaps most exemplified by abolition. Right? They had fought against the Americans, they had fought against the French, but what they had done was abolish the slave trade in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and later they had abolished slavery in their colonies in the 1830s. And that abolitionism was bound up very much with British forms of religion, etc. So you get, figures like David Livingstone. And so Marx is by the end, he's basically talking about how they will find any way of avoiding the question of solidarity with the Union. That the Economist, which is a free trade organ, or the Christian missionary organs that are abolitionists, well, the Americans aren't fighting an abolition war, so we don't have to support them. The Americans are only fighting for the Union is only fighting for mercenary reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And this continues all the way down to Marx's accounts of the Paris Commune, which are also very largely accounts of the way the English press is portrayed. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So, with moderator's privilege, But before I get to my question, I wanted to remind the audience of two things we've heard already today that I think relate. One, we just heard Pinkert invoke the famous quote that Hegel says, philosophy is its own time, comprehended in thought. And Hegel, as a good bourgeois philosopher, said that. And it seems to me to recall the origin of the word journalism, the speaking on the day, du jour. Use of public reason on the big events of the day. So that's one point. And the other point is, in the teaching on capital, we heard that what's often mistaken as Marx's great insights are those of previous bourgeois political economists, Desmond, Smith, Ricardo, what have you. And so, what is taken to be Marx's original contribution, and rather not so much. Now, what would you say Marx thought he was saying that was unique and that the liberal press in their journalism would not have said? If your whole project is about Bonapartism in this 10-year period, how imperialism relates to Bonapartism, what was Marx's intervention there? Why did he have his thumb on the pulse of the moment, and how did others not? How did he understand that?
I mean, the short answer is that Marx isn't saying anything that liberals don't say. Marx knows that, especially because he's writing in the absence of a socialist workers' movement. He does often signal the fact that the defeat of the socialist workers' movement is shaping events fundamentally. So I'll give you the example of the one body of the journalism that I excluded on grounds of length, which is Marx and Engels' writings on the Crimean War, which is the big event of the 1850s. And their journalism, if you published it in the same font, in the same size, it would be like the length of the first volume of Capital. It's an immense body of writing on the Crimean War. And that's a very complicated conflict that almost nobody knows anything about anymore, and therefore no one reads it because Marx presupposes that you know everything, of course, as writing journalism. What he points out there, and it's also one of the ways, with Marxologists, you also often get this dismissal of Engels, especially of his discussion, of his preoccupation with military science, which Engels' nickname was the general in the Marx family. But what you see there is they're covering the Crimean War, just like anyone else would. Largely, they're copying the news reports that are coming in from the front. And it's only the big newspapers it's really the Crimean War invents the role of the war correspondent. And what Engels points out, and Marx also learns this from Engels, is this whole war is phony. Right? Pinkert talked earlier about how Hegel was wrong to think that the age of war was over. Hegel was not wrong. Benjamin Constant was not wrong. They were writing as liberals, and the age of war should have been over, and to a large degree the age of war was over until the 20th century. When you look at something like the Crimean War, Marx and Engels will say, well, it's a phony war. It's a fake war. They won't go to war in a way that stakes their national existence or threatens the national existence of their enemies. Why? Because actually war is there to strengthen all sides against the working class. that war is the lifeblood of the global Bonapartist state. That in fact what spreads or globalizes the Bonapartist state is war. And Marx and Engels perversely support the British because in the Crimean War, which is another reason why no one reads that stuff, because they can't deal with the fact that Marx and Engels are picking a side in a capitalist war. But they're picking a side in the capitalist war because they think that there's a healthy proletarian instinct expressed in hostility towards Russia. And, that comes right out of the 1848 strategy, right? That in 1848, Marx and Engels wanted to force Germany to go to war with Russia. They thought that that would radicalize the revolution in Germany and force it to become a socialist revolution. That the bourgeoisie would not fight against Tsarism ultimately. This is, expressive of the deep hostility towards the Tsar that goes all the way back to the French Revolution from a revolutionary perspective. The Tsar was the gendarme of Europe. And they think also that trying to fight such a war is going to bring the British state to collapse or essentially advance contradictions. But the idea, right, they constantly compare, they say, look, this is not Napoleon's war. The bourgeoisie doesn't fight wars anymore. They're fighting over here in the Crimea. Who gives a fuck about the Crimea, right? It's not going to bring the Tsar down. Napoleon went for Moscow, right? He threatened the national existence of the Tsar state, right? He brought nations down. This is just a kind of spectacle. It's a phony war, right? They are, and throughout, he keeps arguing that the war is the expression of Britain's alliance with Russia, right? It's a total, by making war against the Russians, the British ruling class is showing that they're allied with them. Now, that's not exactly, that's an argument that, in fact, many other Russophobes made. It's not original to Marx, and those people were lunatics who made those arguments. Marx takes those arguments up in a completely other direction to say what's happening is that all sides want to avoid the reemergence of the Revolution of 1848. That's what shapes the conduct of war. That's what shapes global events. That's what shapes events in China. That's what's shaping events in India, right? This is that imperialism is concentrated in Western Europe. That Bonaparte is allied with Palmerston. That right after the Crimean War, he's allied with the Tsar. That in effect, it's a constant alliance. That beneath the conflicts lie the underlying alliance of the Bonapartist state. That's not exactly a proletarian socialist argument. He makes it in the liberal press over and over and over again. What he highlights is simply the refusal for anyone to state the obvious. Right? Trying to take Sevastopol is not a serious military aim. Right? What are these wars about? He also does cover the socialist workers' movement. Right? The only one that survives the ruin of 1848 is Chartism, he thinks, in part because Chartism wasn't properly defeated. And he's involved in trying to revive it up through 1856, and he writes in that press, and he writes about it in the Tribune. But no, the answer to your question is that as capital, and I said this in the talk, just as capital is bourgeois political economy, right? It is, and you can't say this is the part where Marx is breaking with Ricardo, right? But rather, in completing bourgeois political economy, he's undertaking its critique. He's showing that political economy is itself self-contradictory, right? He can both say, I'm a scientist, right? Some of the prefaces and also some of Engels's fake reviews that are in the press, basically say, well, here's Karl Marx. He's a good political economist, just like Ricardo and Adam Smith, and he's like an academic. And he is. Marx wants to be recognized as solving conundra that have been left to him by the political economic tradition. And at the same time, he's showing that that undertaking is self-contradictory under conditions of capital. Similarly, with journalism, Marx's critique of journalism is both, yes, as a kind of a meta-commentary, explicit critique on the journalism of his day, but it's also the attempt to, as it were, stage liberalism in the age of its impossibility. And it kind of doesn't get repeated, right? I think it is a kind of phenomenon of American political backwardness, that there's a liberal newspaper that gives Karl Marx a job for 11 years. America, obviously doesn't register the revolution of 1848. And in that sense, it's backward, and it doesn't have a socialist working class. It's only in the course of the 1850s that in America, it really, is expressed as a crisis of the republic itself, right? And Marx is writing in that moment, in that context. You don't have other Marxists following Marx, as journalists in the capitalist press. They create a socialist press. Aaron. Oh, sorry, Justin.
No, you're good. So I take from what you've read, part of the argument of the book being that Marx and Engels undertook an imminent critique of journalism as a form of expression of how bourgeois society had fallen below itself, or of how the bourgeois press had failed to state the obvious, namely that the war was about the preservation and extension of global bondagism. And one recurrent theme in the conference today has been that of the New Left returning to Marx seemingly as against Marxism, the question of the New Left's Marxology. Mm-hmm. And I think it came out well in the Pinkard interview when there was a question about whether Marx could really express the critique of Hegelian categories philosophically, and Pinkard kind of took it as like, which academic department would Marx be situated in today? Mm-hmm. How Marx isn't even read today as a philosopher, but in a sense as an academic. And I guess the reason I bring that up is since this is a collection of essays about journalism from 1851 to 1862.
Well, he is read as a philosopher. It's just that philosophy is academic.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Pinkard's right about that.
Yeah, he's right about that.
Yeah. So this being a collection of essays of Marx and Engels' journalism over this decade, I wanted to ask how you view that as possibly contributing to, or maybe reevaluating the New Left's take on the legacy of historical Marxism, and in that sense maybe pointing a new way possibly to the critique of mass culture, which the New Left attempted to undertake but kind of couldn't as a result of avoiding the question of women.
I mean, a lot of what I do in the introduction, where I go is basically I argue that there is never going to be a new Marx. That there is only the Marx of orthodoxy or of revisionism. That Marx himself was the bone of contention in the debate within Marxism, right? Bernstein staged revisionism on the ground of Marx. And I argue, what I say is, this is a perverse exercise. I mean, I can't believe that like a normal academic publisher is publishing this book, right? Because I refuse to cite any Marx scholarship, right? And say, well, the debate that took place within the Second International is the debate. And all you can do by ignoring that is fall below the threshold of it, right? And so, I critique the New Left return to Marx for failing to understand that. Because in failing to understand that, they're failing to understand that they live in the wake of the collapse of Marxism, of the failure of orthodoxy, or the defeat of orthodox Marxism. And the reason why that is the case is, and in that sense, you get this gesture, that's very current nowadays about, I guess it's in the title of Jonathan Sperber's book, but it's very common, of we're going to restore Marx to the 19th century. And my argument is, yeah, only if you understand that the 19th century is the most distant century. That Marx is farther away from us than Locke and Hobbes. Or, I don't know, fucking Diogenes. Right? That the project of socialism, of course, is both, it's both near and far in a way that historicism can't grasp, right? But, and in that sense, the debate over orthodoxy is a debate ultimately about bringing the 19th century to bear, or better, bringing 1848 to bear, right? That's really what's at issue. The question, in other words, of recognizing the return to Marx as it were, a dynamic of revolutionary history. So does that get at your question, Justin,
Yeah.
or did I miss anything?
Well,
I think you said something that I'm forgetting now.
Well, the New Left did, one thing that was discussed and that I've been thinking about recently is the New Left made an attempt to politicize mass culture.
Right.
And avoiding confronting the legacy of historical Marxism, didn't understand bourgeois freedoms as the condition for critique. I guess I would just ask,
I would say that, obviously that Marx is the founder of critical theory, right? That it's by no means foreign to Marx and Engels to comment on culture, and the journalism is wonderful that way. Like, one of my favorite articles is, the development of, it's essentially like credit ratings in the 19th century. You could subscribe to a service that would tell you about everyone who had essentially passed a bad check, right? And merchants would do this, and in that way you could have a sense of like credit. And these people are taken to court, and Marx loves to cover that. Or Marx will take up the issue of whether people commit suicide after a hanging. more than they did before. Right? Why does hanging become the essence of the capitalist state? Right? Why, and why does it seem to, in that sense, authorize suicide? Or he'll talk about, the treatment of, the development of insane asylums and what's behind that, and kind of the public discussion of that, and the inability to discuss the fact that everybody's got a crazy uncle, etc. So I think that that kind of journalism, it's important to remember that things that we read, like Krakauer, this was journalism, right? This was in the feuilleton, in the insert in the newspaper, like the New York Times Magazine or something, if you get the Sunday Times, right? You'd read Krakauer, right? Presupposes a higher level of literacy than we have today. I mean, Marx is unbelievable. He'll write in the Chartist press, presumably for the working class, and he'll just be quoting Latin and Greek and German and Italian, just as you please, without any translation. And he expects that people will rise to that level of literacy. And apparently they did. I mean, he was successful as a journalist. When the crisis of 1857 hit New York, the Tribune fired all of its columnists except for Marx. Like, we can't let this guy go. So he was a successful journalist. He was read. He was always reprinted. So I think that, if you think of a lot of what the Frankfurt School do, it's only not journalism because of the general regression that reading should be entertainment after, like, the Second World War. And anything else is somehow offensive. But you think of something like Adorno on, like, the Los Angeles Times astrology column or something like that. Why couldn't that just be in the Los Angeles Times Sunday supplement? Could have been in another world in the 19th century. It would have been. I don't know if that.
Yeah, it seems to connect to the absence of an organized movement for socialism. How cheap that is here. In both cases, kind of as a parallel.
I think so. It's a matter of, like, we want Watneys, right? Like Adorno talks about that slogan, right? Like, giving the people what they want. After, that what they want is, drunkenness and regression. After the war, I think that, that is most certainly related to the collapse of socialism.
Okay, this might be a bit long, Spencer. Normally I try not short questions, but I'm going to be bad. The first part of what I wanted to comment on was the title, Marx and Engels on Imperialism. It's something that we discussed earlier today was, and I'm not trying to go after the title, but, during the capital teaching, we did talk about the historical specificity of the category of imperialism for Lenin. That in the time of the Second International, it is the crisis and split in the workers' movement for socialism that signals imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And that there's a difference between this and, for example, the parliamentary Bonapartism of Palmerston. So when Palmerston basically concocts the Second Opium War with China through the executive and triggers, I don't know what it's called, like a snap election from the liberals who are trying to recall him. And the liberals lose. And what Marx says in one of the writings about Cobden is, wow, look at this guy who everybody was saying was the hero of the working class back when the Chartists allied with the liberals to repeal the Corn Laws. Isn't he so impotent and pathetic? Because in 1857 he really is. And that, like 1848, and this came up in Danny's teaching, the wars abroad, right, and the Second Opium War, by the way, is fought in alliance with Louis Bonaparte in France, appear as a phenomenon of the crisis of the alliance of the radical liberal Democrats and the socialists in France and in England. And to some extent...
I missed the last point that you just made. I'm sorry. What appeared as the crisis of that alliance? Sorry.
Bonapartism and also the wars. Like the wars abroad were kind of the occasion for it. That in some sense, maybe we could say, and this is something your presentation made me think, that this is, the alliance between the socialists and the liberals, and the subsequent crisis of liberalism out of which, Marxism emerges, is the occasion for Marx to be writing and commenting within the liberal press. Whereas in Lenin's time, right, we get this in the 5th chapter of What Is to Be Done, which normally people kind of bashfully skip over in reading through. He calls for an independent journalistic organ for the working class movement, that it's actually necessary to have independent journalism and an independent paper. You can't, like Marx, go and write in the liberal outlets for this reason. I just thought it might be interesting, Spencer, for you to kind of talk more about parliamentary Bonapartism and the crisis of liberalism and how it relates to the book that you put together. And then the other thing I wanted to ask, which is not unrelated, but a very different question, is I felt as though one of the slight or subtle provocations of your presentation was how Marx commented on capitalist politics, and how, in fact, Marx and Engels expressed their preference for the British in the Crimean War, and may in some ways have appeared to be not completely neutral in matters of capitalist politics. And so I wondered, Spencer, if you could comment on the last 5 years of the Trump president, 4 years, I guess, of the Trump presidency, and now another year of post-Trump. Nobody's been president for 5 years. The question of Platypus, about commenting on capitalist politics. I mean, we published several articles by Chris Cutrone in the Platypus Review, which kind of more or less were short commentaries on present-day capitalist politics and journalism to a certain extent, or at least what people were talking about in the public sphere. So I think that is quite enough. Thank you.
That is quite enough. So yeah, what I think the first part of your question is signaling, I said that the 1850s were the darkest political time in Marx and Engels' lives, and yet it's not like now, right? They know, they're absolutely convinced, even though there's nothing affirming it, right? We alone have learned our lesson, right? We alone have learned the lesson of the Revolution of 1848, right? All these, the early stuff in the book is largely about exile politics, right? Mazzini this and Kossuth that, right? And all of these, German jackasses, and Blanqui writes a letter calling them all traitors to the revolution, and Marx translates that into English, etc. So he's very much concerned to, with the possible exception of Louis Blanqui, who he identifies as, the leader of the French proletariat in the address to the Communist League in 1850. To slam people who have come out of the revolution having learned nothing. He believes that socialism will, remains the unaddressed question of the epoch, despite the fact that it lies in ruins as a project. So first of all, he thinks that maybe an economic crisis will bring back a recurrence of the revolution. He abandons that idea over the course of the 1850s, and it really is what opens the door to the writing of Capital, is when he really abandons entirely any notion that economics is going to determine politics. Right? That's what opens the door to the theory of the fetishism of commodities. It's what opens the door to Capital as a critique of democracy, right? As a book about democracy. So he has that illusion that he's shedding over the course of the 1850s. And as far as the consolidation of Parliament, he believes that maybe the liberals, he doesn't know, right, what he's living in it. He doesn't know what Cobden and Bright might be able to do in terms of British politics or how far it will go. You rightly identify the Opium War, the Second Opium War, or the Arrow War, as it's sometimes called, as the moment where liberalism seems to have its last gasp, where all of these heroes of the Anti-Corn Law League rise up in opposition to Palmerston, who's making war without raising the revenue, without getting the money, from Parliament, approved by Parliament. He's making war by fiat, right? We take this for granted, right? But we still learn in civics class the legislature's supposed to pay, they're supposed to declare war, right? They're going through just that crisis, right? This is what I meant by permanent executive government, right? Palmerston is making war around the world without ever asking for the money, and thus for the declaration. When they lose that, in Palmerston, what happens is Palmerston says, oh yeah, you want a vote of no confidence? Well, fuck you, I dissolve Parliament, and let's have an election. And he goes to the country and makes jingoistic appeals and wins. And that is what leads to the formation of the Liberal Party. Right? At that point, the Liberals are like, there's no opposing Palmerston. So Gladstone, Cobden, Bright, they all joined with Palmerston, the formation of the Liberal Party in 1859, which is in power throughout the Civil War. So that's really the kind of the true beginning, the consolidation of parliamentary Bonapartism. It ultimately requires a reorganization of party politics in Britain. The overarching question is really, I think, what is the significance of the First International? Right? In other words, you were raising the question, and really implicit in this whole discussion of liberalism, Marxist support for, or the First International support for, the American Civil War, is the question of the relationship of the First International to liberalism. And obviously Marx and Engels believed that the American Civil War will bring the Republican Party to crisis. Right? That they're going to support it in bringing itself to crisis. But is the First International a party in France, in England? It's obviously not formed like the Second International. There aren't national parties. Is it the international party? right? Is there one international workers' party for socialism, and that is the International Working Man's Association? In other words, is the International Working Man's Association in direct political competition with the Liberal Party in England, with the Republican Party, in which it's in a kind of tacit alliance, but ultimately going to split, right? That's the question, right? I would say that the First International is understood by Marx and Engels as transitional, right? It's genuinely open-ended whether the First International is going to try to become the organ for the organization of an independent working class socialist movement worldwide. And I think that Marx, in espousing the commune, is pressing exactly that question. Right? He's breaking with his trade union allies in England over that. Right? In other words, he's trying to split the First International and say, let's be a proletarian party for socialism, let's be for the dictatorship of the proletariat, let's affirm the Paris Commune. Right? And I think he brings the First International to crisis on that question and realizes that he can't prosecute that question any further and dissolves it. Right? Having established that, right, as a kind of basis for the Second International. Right? That would be the way that so he understands the revolutions of the 1860s as working through the question of liberalism by, in other words, can the revolutions of the 1860s, provoked by the American Civil War above all, be a context for the reconstitution of proletarian independence, right? And that's exactly what is the red thread that runs through the First International, if you follow it, and especially why he dissolves it. He dissolves it by saying, Paris Commune, God damn it, I'm going to affirm it. I'm going to be the infamous Dr. Marx, and he becomes Karl Marx when he writes the defense of the Paris Commune, when he writes the Civil War in France. That's when he becomes an internationally notorious socialist leader. And then he sends it to New York to die a quiet death. The last part, the part of your question about Lenin and imperialism, what I would say is that when Lenin is saying that he lives in the age of imperialism, he's taking for granted that it's a repetition, right? That it is the age of imperialism, and it's the age of imperialism since the Boer War, right? The Boer War is the indication that Europe is heading towards World War, right? Britain and Germany are effectively at war in South Africa, right? And it's a proxy war. And Lenin thinks, and that's what occasions Hobson to write, right? Hobson becomes concerned with the question of imperialism by writing journalism about the Boer War. So the era from, if you want to sort of specify it, from 1899 to 1914 is the era of imperialism, or from 1899 to today is the era of imperialism as identified by Lenin, insofar as the tasks identified in the imperialism pamphlet went unaddressed in and through the crisis of Marxism. But what's coming into being in 1899 for Lenin, right, and of course it's no coincidence, as Marx is no accident, right, as Marxists would say, that 1899 is the year of the revisionist dispute. Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism is to say This is, as it were, imperialism becoming adequate to its own concept as the epoch of socialist revolution. Right? Because that's what Marx means by imperialism. Right? What Louis Napoleon's coup d'etat did was prepare the ground for socialist revolution. Right? It clarified the tasks of socialist revolution. It centralized the state for the working class to seize power of, to seize control of. So, right, it's the what's the image? You know, the old mole image in the 18th Brumaire, right, that Rosa Luxemburg picks back up. So I think that Lenin, when he says it's the era of imperialism, he means it's the era of imperialism something like 2.5. Because the first era of imperialism is the era that ends with the Paris Commune and the crisis of 1872 and gives rise to the SPD. The second era of imperialism is from the formation of the SPD to the to the formation of the Second International in 1889 to the crisis of the Second International in 1899. And the era of imperialism 2.5 is the era of the crisis of the Second International, right? And the crisis of the Second International is bringing Marx's project finally to bear on world history. Marxism is becoming world historic. It's becoming bound up with the crisis of imperialism and thus potentially resolving it. I think that's what Lenin is saying when he calls, you know, his era the era of imperialism. He certainly doesn't mean that there hasn't been imperialism before now, right?
I had a question about the curation of the journalistic articles. So, well,
The curation?
Yeah, the selection.
Yeah.
Because this is sort of a half question, or maybe it's to make something explicit that you hinted at in your presentation, in your preface. So, for example, I have I think it's a Penguin book, Selected Journalism of Marx. It has Marx from China, Ireland, the U.S. Civil War.
Yeah.
And kind of that introduction would be more like, well, the brilliance of Karl Marx is not just an economist, he's also a journalist. He's a multifaceted figure, great 19th century intellectual.
I like that book.
Right. Something that you hinted at is one of the ways in which the new left would intervene would say, well, look, Karl Marx has something to say about China, Karl Marx has something to say about Afghanistan, or that's Engels' article, something to say about colonialism. And here you're curating it in a way, well, there was one thing I noticed, which was there was some kind of emphasis about liberal rights and the defense of that as being an organizing form in the Second International. I think Engels writes a letter, he says, beneath socialism is liberalism, some supporter in Germany, which obviously would ring in a certain way in the last,
It's really important in the critique of the LaSallians.
It's right, because LaSalle kind of says, well, those Americans only care about individual rights. I think he says it at dinner to Marx. But I guess what I'm saying is...
LaSalle's willing to betray the civil rights of the working class for the vote.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying is you're also hinting at a lot of where the left is today. So that's why I was saying, to what degree do you see this curation as an intervention and related to the...
Oh, that's what I didn't answer with Aaron's question. Yeah.
Oh, was there another? And also in terms of something else I'll point out is the emphasis on the continuity regarding the question of Bonapartism from 1848 and through his journalism. Meaning, I think the way in which Marxist journalism is sometimes even treated is as like unfortunate. Not that it's bad, but oh wow, it would have been great if Marx had more time to work on his economic studies. or
Right.
work on his philosophy or something.
Oh, that's really typical. Yeah.
Right, and in other words, but you're actually drawing out that no, this is part of the totality of the entirety of Marx's project, and the different ways in which he would preserve and return to those questions, whether in the critique of political economy, as I was trying to get at this morning, as the preservation of the lessons of 1848. He's doing the same in terms of his journalism, but also how the journalism, as you were just saying in response to Aaron's question, is actually part of the development of his latter critique of political economy, that he's changing his mind after 1857. You can even trace it in the Grundrisse in a way that he starts to discuss certain questions afterwards. So I guess all of this is kind of subsumed under this one question of how you see your curation of Marxist journalism as whether it's uncovering something that you feel has been potentially lost in I would just say the 20th century, right? And how you, I don't know if you want to call it an intervention, or maybe all call it an intervention, your curation of these journalism articles and this publication.
Right. So the journalism is viewed as a distraction, right? Or it's a result of he has to pay his bills. All of which is true. This is not only the worst time of Marx and Engels' lives politically, it's definitely the worst time of their lives personally. Marx buries, I think, 3 children in the 1850s. It's including a child that had grown to a significant age at 8 or 9, right? Was a person. And that was certainly the most devastating thing that ever happened to Marx in his life. And it was in part because he was poor. One of the arguments that I make is that Marx abandons, so implicitly what we're saying, and Danny understands these things, so we've talked about it many times, is that the writing of the critique of political economy that you see in the 1844 manuscripts, or in the Poverty of Philosophy, or in Wage, Labor, and Capital in 1848, is different from the critique of political economy as it takes shape after the drafting of the Grundrisse in 1857. And what happens after 1857, as I've tried to suggest, is that the critique of political economy becomes an argument about the phantasmagoria of democracy, of the prosecution of socialist revolution as a project of winning the battle of democracy. That's ultimately what Capital's about. It's a political book. And that's not exactly there in the earlier period, right? The fetishism of commodities is not exactly there. So the journalism isn't an interruption. Marx interrupts his own political economic studies. And if he goes to work as a journalist to pay the bills, and no doubt he does do that, he ends his journalism as a political act. He ends his journalism with the publication or the dissemination of the Emancipation Proclamation in the American Civil War. That is the reason why he says now is the time for the formation of a new international. He writes about the Battle of Antietam and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation and the English working class's solidarity with the Union cause, and quits. He's fired by the Tribune because he's too radical pushing, but he quits Die Presse, which he writes for in Vienna, and devotes his energy full time to the organization of the First International throughout 1863. And so I think that Marx writes Capital when he's good and ready, and I don't think anything distracts him. I think he's a goddamn genius, and he had as many hours in the day as he needed. Right? He he figured out a way to write a massive amount under extremely adverse circumstances. And I'm not here to say that he couldn't have written whatever he wanted to write at any given time. I think he wrote whatever he wanted to at whatever time. And so I think that, this idea that, and it's also, of course, it goes hand in hand with this, with the absurd idea that you guys ably dismissed in the morning, that capital is a social theory and that Marx is important as a social theorist of capitalism. And so what we want to know about Marx is, the story of the writing of Capital and everything. I mean, for most Marxologists today, the 18th Brumaire is a distraction. It's all a distraction. The revolution's a distraction from the writing of Capital. If you read, these jackass neo-Marxologists like Marcello Musto, who's trying to create a Marxology industry at York University, he skips the 1848 revolution in a biography of Marx. I mean, it's just staggering. He says, well, every biographer's got to make choices. And, publishers don't like to publish long books anymore, so I had to cut a few things. And I cut the revolution of 1848. It's like, disqualified. Disqualified. So, I feel misgivings in the face of that Penguin volume that you mentioned. Because the Penguin volume is great. Everyone should have it. The guy just puts a lot of great writings between two covers by Karl Marx. And it's Karl Marx, it's fucking great. The introduction is nothing fancy, it's nothing to worry about. He selects the writings on the basis of their accessibility. I think that that's a great thing for students to have the opportunity to pick up for $10. My book is not going to be $10, and it's not going to be easy. It's got a weighty apparatus in which I'm making a great big argument that the guy's name is James Ledbetter, who edited that Penguin edition. He doesn't burden the text with an apparatus, right? I have 8 sections with introductions to each one, right? It's an elaborate book, and it's prosecuting kind of graduate level arguments in Marxism, right? And so I would rather produce a book for students, but quite frankly, this isn't the first thing that students need to read, and Ledbetter's adequate if they wanted to read. And the first thing that students should read is, political writings of Karl Marx, above all the writings on 1848, especially on France, the Manifesto, etc. We already know that, the canon's already there, and I'm not saying that these writings should take the place of that. That would be absurd. It's rather a kind of argument about what if you take writings that were unknown to the Second International Marxists, who made the argument about orthodoxy, that were largely unaddressed by the 20th century, even though they were published in the 20th century, they were largely unaddressed. What if we prosecute the argument about orthodoxy via these writings? That's in effect what I've done. Right? I've said Marx is a critic of democracy. Marx is a critic of the capitalist state. Right? That he is the Marx of orthodoxy, even in his fucking journalism. Right? That's the principle of curation. Right? Is to illustrate that point, to illustrate the continuity between 1852 and 1871, the 18th Brumaire and the Civil War in France. About commenting on capitalist politics, to get back to what Aaron was asking me. Well, of course the left comments on capitalist politics, but do they, in a sense, pick sides and cheer in capitalist politics? Well, for Marx, when there's nothing else, Of course. You're interested in what within capitalist politics has the most potential for creating a fruitful situation for the development of socialist politics. So we can't help but see ourselves in that moment, though, as I tried to emphasize, Marx has a confidence rightly placed that he does live in the epoch of socialism, that the 19th century is the century of socialism, that this is a temporary political defeat, that this is just old-fashioned reaction, but the working class's project will be on the table. And of course, he's right about that. Whether Marx and Engels ever lived, socialism would have come back in the 1860s. What destiny it has is another question without Marx and Engels. But they're right about that. We don't know that socialism is ever coming back. Generations have passed without socialism. For God's sake, a century has passed without socialism. Without the project of a socialist revolution centered in the core of capitalism, which is to say, the project of socialism. So I see no reason why we wouldn't be discussing capitalist politics as to what would be the most fruitful, development. Would I have preferred that Donald Trump continue to break the Republican Party? Yes. Of course I would. I hate the fucking old Republican Party. I thought Trump was a vast improvement. And I thought he defended liberalism in important ways. Still do. Thought the opposition to Donald Trump was wretched and illiberal. And it is. Right? I mean, I mentioned that the right of free speech and the right of assembly, the right of free association are all under assault today. I never thought that I would see the right of assembly under assault. Right? But now apparently Donald Trump's rally on the Mall, where it will be tomorrow, was a criminal fascistic act. Right? It's insane. Right? So yeah, I tend to think that until you have as deep a sense of liberalism as Marx and Engels had, until you defend Hegel as a liberal against the young Hegelians in their falling below the threshold of liberalism, until you defend bourgeois ideology as in important ways in advance of the left, you can't think like a Marxist. You can't think what Marxist politics is, right? So I think that, my first gut level response to capitalist politics is always about, is always thinking through liberalism, right? Is this illiberal? Does this gut people's rights? Does this gut the ability of society to reflect upon itself? Does Facebook censoring your posts, does that diminish the self-consciousness of society? Yes, it does, right? So, yeah, I'm against that. I think that, the real issue behind your question is, is this done in any kind of responsible way? In the way that sectarian organizations attempted to do that. Sectarian organizations attempted to comment on capitalist politics in an, as it were, a disciplined way. I think that that's antithetical to the intersection of young people with the memory of Marxism. But I think confronting young people with the memory of Marxism is obstructed by insisting on a political line. Because I think a lot of young people are confused politically and they don't know what they think, and they might be coming from the left, they might be coming from an activist perspective, they might really be, pretty much Democrats, they might be kind of libertarians, whatever. I don't want to ask that about young people. I don't want to know that about recruits in Platypus, right? I want to know what's your interest in Marxism, what's your interest in socialism, right? All of the rest of it, that's what I would say is that, on the one hand, it's undisciplined, the way that we talk about capitalist politics, right? It sort of raises the question, Chris on the list, like, is that Chris's view? Or is that Platypus's view? We never really adjudicate those questions, right? We don't, the kinds of things that we would discuss on the Platypus list internally wouldn't be the same thing that we publish in the PR. I don't know if that's anything like what you were asking me about.
Sure, sort of, Spencer. Part of what made me bring it up actually was that Jack Clark, in a very strange way, seemed to have his own kind of spontaneous version of an argument about this. That Jack Clark, as a member of DSOC and the realignment strategy, felt that he had to have a sense of how Marxists ought to think about capitalist politics, right, and orient themselves towards capitalist politics. And also, he justified it on the basis of, what he said in the interview is that in Marx's time, there was a proletariat had a unified interest that was becoming the majority of society and it would make revolution. And we don't have that anymore, and we haven't had it in a long time. And that's why we can't have that type of independent politics. Of course, this is different from Spencer's argument, not saying that they're making the same argument. But I found it actually kind of interesting how, in a certain way, he's faced with the same problem that we also have to deal with, which is in the absence, right, of socialism, of the struggle for socialism, how does one adjudicate one's relationship to liberalism? And, Jack Clark, I thought what was wonderful about the interview is that if you don't believe what Theodore Adorno says in Reflections on Class Theory about rackets, you just have to watch the interview that we did today, and you will see, because that's what Jack Clark describes, is how, new forces arise in society, and maybe you can support these new forces against other older forces within capitalist politics. But I thought that was interesting, and I also thought that it's of interest to Platypus members to know how Marxists would have attempted to think about their relationship to capitalist politics in the 19th century. And then also, what do we make of the sectarians and new leftists, right, that we're trying to learn from in Platypus, who have their own way of conceiving of their relationship to capitalist politics. And it seems to me that it's not enough to say, well, Marxists just don't comment, because clearly all of these Marxists think they have to. And I thought it was interesting that that emerged as kind of a little red thread through, by accident, through the different events that we have today.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, there's a provocative comment in the Nettle argument, in the Nettle text that we read, in which Nettle remarks upon how Rosa Luxemburg is prosecuting her critique of the party of the SPD in journalism. And we don't have this journalism in English. And there's a Rosa Luxemburg translation project afoot. But they're obviously doing everything but the journalism. Right? That'll be the last thing that comes out.
Should we just do the journalism ourselves?
Maybe we should do it ourselves.
Yeah, maybe we should do some of it.
But, I think you should read everything by the great revolutionaries. Full stop. Right? I think that if you want to learn history, you should learn about who are the most radical people who were writing about their time, and just read what they said. If you want to read about the French Revolution, you should read Marat's newspaper that gives you a sense of that event, right, in a way that nothing else will. And in fact, it's what the great historians do, right? Eric Hobsbawm just is reading the revolutionaries of the 19th century and writing down what they say and calling it research. Right? Everything that he has to say about the 19th century, he's getting from Marx and the guy whose journalism we do have, Lenin. Right? Because everything by Lenin's in English. So, of course people talk about capitalist politics. Of course they talk about the real fucking world. Right? They talk about the wars that are ongoing. They talk about, the drive to build a German navy to challenge the British. They're talking about, crazy shenanigans in the Sudan, conflicts between British and French imperialism. They talk about all of those things. Of course they are. And I think it's, one of the things that the sectarians provide, and it's a kind of a false, it's tricky because that continues after Marxism. So, for instance, Ethan wrote a paper for the PR on the Cuban Revolution. What did he turn to? The journalism of the Spartacus League from the Times. Right? Anyone trying to figure out the 20th century is going to look at sectarian literature, sectarian newspapers and journals to figure out what happened. You'll get the best analysis, and and it'll be better than anything you could possibly learn from a professor. Right? All of whom are way below the threshold of the people who live through events and don't even try, right? And think that they have the benefit of hindsight. No such thing. So yeah, we're trained to think about politics by thinking about it on analogy, right? Chris, in his recent interview with Doug Lane, talked about the way that the Spartacists tried to think on analogy about, humanitarian efforts to help patients after a massive earthquake. And of course, at the time of the outbreak of the Afghan War and of the Iraq War, leftists trotted out Trotsky saying, you have to align yourself even with someone as awful as Haile Selassie in Ethiopia against Italian fascism, right? It doesn't matter, in other words, that if you're anti-imperialist, you're in alliance with the Taliban, or you're in alliance with Saddam Hussein. Here's this proof text by Leon Trotsky that will tell you, that this is our proletarian duty. So, if you don't know, and that's what knowing history in effect amounts to in the age of capital, right? It's knowing the history of political conflicts and debates and struggles. That's what it is to know history, right? Is to know what Lenin's thought about X, Y, or Z, or whoever else you are trying to learn from. And what you see in us talking about capitalist politics today, we'll often talk of, someone like Richard will be sort of vague about it. He'll say, well, this is a question of a sensibility. What is that sensibility? It's a historical knowledge of the history of leftist politics. That's what it is. It's muscle memory that comes from that understanding, right? From that study. But yeah, I think it's just people turn these things in. They're unaware of the fact that that's what Lenin and Luxemburg did. That's what their day job was to fill the pages of Iskra with content, right? And that it wasn't commentary on Marx or something, right? It was commentary on the issues of the day. It was in competition with the capitalist press. Maybe we should drink? Yeah? It's getting,